November 1944, somewhere in the fog-shrouded forests of eastern France. A young American infantry lieutenant crouched in a muddy foxhole, his company pinned down by German machine gun fire that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. His men were scattered across 200 yards of broken woodland, taking casualties, running low on ammunition. In the chaos and confusion of combat, with artillery shells screaming overhead and the distinctive ripping sound of German MG-42 machine guns tearing through the trees, the lieutenant reached for the radio handset clipped to his equipment. Within seconds, his voice travelled clearly through the electromagnetic chaos of the battlefield to his battalion command post 3 miles to the rear. Within minutes, American artillery batteries were firing precise, coordinated barrages on the German positions. Within 15 minutes, the German fire had been suppressed enough for the company to withdraw to better defensive positions. 3 miles away, in a farmhouse serving as temporary headquarters, the battalion commander had maintained constant awareness of the tactical situation through continuous radio contact. He had been able to coordinate artillery support, redirect reserve forces, and maintain control of his entire battalion across miles of contested terrain. This immediate, reliable communication represented a revolutionary capability that no army in human history had ever possessed at the infantry level. Meanwhile, in those same November forests, German infantry commanders were still relying on the same communication methods their grandfathers had used in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Runners, messengers on foot or bicycle, carrying written orders and reports through forests and across fields swept by artillery fire and small arms fire. These messengers often took 30 minutes or more to cover distances that radio transmissions crossed in microseconds. They frequently arrived, wounded, exhausted, or didn't arrive at all, cut down by shell fire or machine gun bullets before they could deliver their vital messages. German officers watched their tactical situations deteriorate while they waited desperately for information that might already be obsolete by the time it finally reached them. This communication disparity, this fundamental difference in how quickly commanders could understand their tactical situations and respond to changing circumstances, represented one of the most decisive yet least celebrated advantages the American military possessed in World War II. This is the story of how American engineers created practical, reliable tactical radio communications that gave ordinary soldiers capabilities previously reserved for the highest levels of command, and how that innovation contributed materially to winning the war. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The revolution in battlefield communications that would give American forces such overwhelming advantages began not on the battlefields of Europe or the Pacific, but in the research laboratories and engineering workshops of American industry in the years immediately preceding America's entry into World War II. The story intertwines technological innovation, institutional resistance, personal courage in advocacy, and the urgent pressure of impending war that accelerated development timelines that might otherwise have stretched across decades. Understanding how American forces achieved their communication superiority requires understanding where military communications stood in 1940, and why the radios available at that time were so inadequate for the demands of modern warfare. Military forces had used various forms of distance communication throughout history: signal flags, drum beats, trumpet calls, signal fires. All had served to transmit simple, pre-arranged messages across distances greater than human voice could carry. The invention of electrical telegraph in the 1840s had revolutionized strategic and operational level communications, allowing commanders to coordinate movements of armies across hundreds of miles. Field telephone systems using wire lines had become standard in World War I, connecting frontline positions to rear headquarters through networks of buried cables and overhead wires. But these wire-based systems had severe limitations in mobile warfare. Wire lines took time to lay, were vulnerable to artillery fire, and could be cut by enemy action or simple equipment failure. Once attacking forces advanced beyond their wire communications, they often lost contact with supporting units and higher headquarters. The infantry squad leader leading his men forward in an attack, the company commander trying to coordinate his platoons during a confused engagement, the battalion commander attempting to understand what was happening across his entire sector. These frontline leaders had no way to communicate reliably beyond voice range except by sending runners. Radio technology promised to solve these communication problems by transmitting voice or Morse code through the air without requiring physical wire connections. Radio could maintain communications with moving forces. Radio couldn't be cut by artillery fire. But the radio technology available in the late 1930s and early 1940s was primitive, unreliable, and ill-suited for the brutal conditions of infantry combat. The United States Army had experimented with portable infantry radios during the late 1930s. These early attempts had been disappointing failures that had actually made many infantry officers deeply skeptical about radio communications in general. The SCR-194 and SCR-195, among the first attempts to provide, infantrymen with portable radio equipment had proven so unreliable that many commanders preferred to continue using runners despite all the obvious disadvantages of that ancient communication method. These early portable radios used amplitude modulation technology, the same AM technology that civilian broadcast radio stations used. AM radio worked adequately for broadcast purposes, where powerful transmitters in fixed locations sent signals to receivers that didn't need to transmit back. But AM had fundamental technical limitations that made it extremely problematic for military battlefield use. AM signals were extraordinarily vulnerable to electrical interference and noise. Every running vehicle engine generated electrical noise through its ignition system. Every electric motor produced interference. Lightning, atmospheric disturbances, even certain types of terrain created static and noise that overwhelmed weak AM signals. On a modern battlefield filled with thousands of running vehicles, electrical equipment, artillery fire, and all the electromagnetic chaos of mechanized warfare, AM radios often became nearly useless. The signal would be drowned in crackling, hissing static that made voice communications unintelligible. Operators would strain to hear messages through the noise, frequently requiring multiple repetitions. Critical communications would fail at exactly the moments when they were most desperately needed. Beyond the interference problems, early portable military radios suffered from numerous other deficiencies that limited their practical utility. They were heavy, often weighing 50 pounds or more with batteries, far too heavy for an infantryman to carry along with his weapons, ammunition, and other combat equipment while remaining effective as a fighting soldier. Battery technology in the late 1930s was primitive. Batteries were heavy, had limited capacity, and drained quickly, especially in cold weather. A radio might function for only a few hours before its batteries died, leaving the operator with an expensive paperweight until fresh batteries could be obtained. The radios used vacuum tube technology that was fragile and temperamental. Vacuum tubes could break from shock and vibration. They required warm-up time before the radio would function. They consumed substantial electrical power, draining batteries even faster. The circuitry was unstable, requiring frequent adjustment and tuning by operators who often lacked the technical knowledge to keep the equipment functioning properly. Many early military radios used primitive, regenerative, or super-regenerative receiver circuits that were notoriously difficult to tune and incredibly unstable in operation. An operator might spend minutes carefully adjusting multiple control knobs to receive a clear signal, only to have the tuning drift off frequency moments later, requiring constant retuning. Under the stress of combat, with incoming fire and the need to move quickly, this constant fiddling with controls was impossible. Range was severely limited. Most handheld or backpack portable radios in 1940 had maximum effective ranges measured in hundreds of yards to perhaps 1 mile under optimal conditions. This might suffice for communications within a single platoon, but it was completely inadequate for company-to-battalion communications or for any of the longer-range coordination that modern mobile warfare required. The unreliability of these early radios had created deep cynicism among infantry officers about radio communications. Many experienced commanders had learned through bitter experience that they couldn't depend on radios when it really mattered. They had watched critical communications fail during training exercises. They had experienced radios that worked perfectly in garrison conditions but failed completely in field environments. They had grown so skeptical of radio reliability that many preferred to trust runners, the perfectly inside Pete, ancient method of communication that had served armies for thousands of years. A runner might be slower than radio, might be killed or wounded en route, might arrive too late to affect the tactical situation. But when a runner did arrive, you could be absolutely certain the message was accurate and complete. Radios offered no such certainty. Messages might be garbled by static, partially lost in interference, completely blocked by terrain or distance. Infantry officers who had experienced these failures naturally and understandably concluded that radios were interesting technical novelties, but not reliable tools for actual combat operations. This deep institutional skepticism about radio communications represented a significant obstacle that would need to be overcome before new radio technology could gain acceptance. Simply developing a better radio wouldn't be enough. The new radio would need to be so dramatically superior, so obviously more capable and reliable than previous equipment, that it could overcome years of accumulated disappointment and skepticism. Into this challenging environment came Daniel Earl Noble, a radio engineer who understood both the theoretical possibilities of new radio technology and the practical requirements of field communications. Born on October 4, 1901, in Noratuck, Connecticut, Noble had pursued electrical engineering at the University of Connecticut, earning his degree and immediately diving into the emerging field of radio communications. He had made his reputation by designing and implementing the nation's first statewide two-way FM radio communication system for the Connecticut State Police, completed in 1940. This wasn't just an academic exercise or laboratory demonstration. It was a practical, operational communications system that had to work reliably day after day under real-world conditions. Police officers in patrol cars scattered across Connecticut needed to communicate with dispatchers and with each other regardless of weather, terrain, or time of day. The system had to function in cities where electrical interference from motors and power lines created enormous electromagnetic noise. It had to work in rural areas where distances were great and terrain varied. It had to be reliable enough that officers would trust their lives to it. Noble's Connecticut State Police system had proven that frequency modulation radio technology, which was still considered exotic and experimental by many radio engineers, could provide reliable communications under exactly the kinds of challenging conditions that had defeated amplitude modulation systems. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Frequency modulation, invented by Edwin Howard Armstrong in 1933 after years of research and experimentation, represented a fundamentally different approach to radio transmission than the amplitude modulation that had dominated radio technology since its invention. In AM transmission, the information, whether voice or music, was encoded by varying the amplitude or strength of the radio signal while keeping its frequency constant. In FM transmission, the information was encoded by varying the frequency of the signal while keeping its amplitude relatively constant. This seemingly technical difference had profound practical implications for radio performance under real-world conditions. FM signals had inherent resistance to electrical noise and interference that AM signals simply could not match. Electrical interference from motors, ignition systems, lightning, and atmospheric disturbances primarily affected the amplitude of radio signals. An FM receiver, designed to respond only to frequency variations and largely ignore amplitude variations, could effectively reject most forms of electrical interference that would completely overwhelm an AM receiver operating in the same environment. FM provided consistent signal quality across its entire effective range. An AM signal gradually faded into progressively worse static and noise as the receiver moved away from the transmitter. At the edge of its range, an AM signal became a frustrating mix of garbled words and overwhelming static. An FM signal, by contrast, maintained good quality across most of its range, then rather suddenly faded into silence when the receiver moved beyond effective range. This meant that within its operational range, FM provided clear, intelligible communications that didn't require operators to strain to understand messages through background noise. FM was less affected by signal fading and multipath distortion that occurred when radio waves bounced off terrain features or buildings. These technical advantages made FM dramatically superior for mobile communications in complex terrain, exactly the conditions that military forces would encounter in combat operations. But FM also had characteristics that many radio engineers and military planners in 1940 considered serious disadvantages. FM required substantially wider bandwidth than AM. Where an AM voice channel might occupy 10 kHz of radio spectrum, a comparable FM channel required roughly 200 kHz. This 10-to-1 or greater bandwidth requirement meant that far fewer FM channels could fit into any given frequency allocation. In an era when radio spectrum was already considered a scarce resource with many competing users, this bandwidth requirement seemed like a serious limitation. FM transmitters and receivers required more sophisticated circuitry than their AM counterparts. The circuits needed to generate frequency-modulated signals, and to receive and demodulate them properly, were more complex than the relatively simple circuits used in AM equipment. This complexity raised legitimate concerns about reliability, about the ability of field maintenance, personnel to repair equipment, and about manufacturing costs. Many radio engineers who had spent their entire careers working with AM technology were skeptical that FM could work reliably in portable military radios. They pointed to the bandwidth requirements, the circuit complexity, and the relatively limited experience with FM in practical applications. They argued that the military should stick with proven AM technology rather than gambling on exotic FM systems that might fail under field conditions. This was the technical and institutional environment when Daniel Noble walked through the doors of Galvin Manufacturing Corporation in Chicago in September 1940 to take up his position as Director of Research. Galvin Manufacturing, which would eventually become known worldwide as Motorola, was a relatively young company that had been founded by Paul Galvin in 1928. The company had initially made its reputation and its profits manufacturing car radios, the devices that would eventually lead to the Motorola name, a combination of motor and Victrola. By 1940, Galvin Manufacturing had begun to diversify into other radio products, including portable communications equipment. The company had already achieved some success with the handy-talkie, a compact handheld AM radio designated SCR-536 by the military. This radio, engineered primarily by Don Mitchell, who served as Galvin's chief engineer, represented genuine innovation for its time. It was compact, with all components including microphone, speaker, batteries, and antenna integrated into a single 5-pound case that a soldier could carry in one hand and operate with reasonable ease. It operated on high-frequency AM from 3,500 to 6,000 kilocycles, using crystal-controlled frequency selection for improved stability compared to earlier designs. The military had been sufficiently impressed to award production contracts, and the SCR-536 was being manufactured in significant quantities. But the handy-talkie had one fundamental limitation that couldn't be overcome within its basic design parameters. Its maximum effective range was approximately 1 mile under favorable conditions, and often substantially less under field conditions with terrain obstacles or electrical interference. This made it useful for communications within platoons or between nearby company elements, but completely inadequate for longer-range communications between companies and battalions or for coordination across the distances that modern mobile warfare required. The tactical advantages that American forces gained from superior radio communications became dramatically apparent as the war progressed through 1944 and into 1945. But perhaps nowhere was the disparity between American and German battlefield communications more starkly illustrated than in the final desperate months of the war, when German forces, stripped of resources and increasingly isolated, found their communication systems degrading to levels that would have seemed primitive even by World War I standards. By early 1945, as Allied armies pushed into Germany from both east and west, German military communications had deteriorated catastrophically. The Wehrmacht, once among the most technologically sophisticated military forces in the world, found itself increasingly unable to coordinate even basic operations. Fuel shortages meant that motorcycle couriers, the mobile messengers who had carried orders and reports throughout the German military system, could no longer function effectively. The motorcycles sat immobile for lack of gasoline, while desperate commanders waited for information and orders that never arrived. Radio equipment that had never been particularly reliable, even under optimal conditions, now failed completely as spare parts became unavailable, as trained radio operators were killed or captured faster than they could be replaced. As the entire German logistics and maintenance system collapsed under the weight of total war fought on multiple fronts against enemies with overwhelming industrial superiority, German infantry divisions, battered and under strength, often found themselves fighting with communication systems that had regressed to the 19th century. Officers sent runners on foot to carry messages between units separated by only a few hundred yards, because they had no other way to communicate. These runners, often young soldiers barely trained for combat, had to cross ground, swept by artillery fire and small arms fire. Many never completed their journeys. The messages they carried, even when they did arrive, were often obsolete by the time they reached their destinations. Tactical situations in the fluid warfare of 1945 changed by the minute. Information that was current when a runner departed might be completely irrelevant 15 or 20 minutes later when he finally reached his destination, assuming he survived the journey at all. American forces, by contrast, maintained sophisticated multi-layered communication networks that functioned reliably even under the most challenging combat conditions. The SCR-300 provided company-to-battalion communications across distances of several miles. The SCR-536, handy-talkie, allowed squad and platoon leaders to coordinate at shorter ranges. Vehicle-mounted FM radios like the SCR-508 and SCR-608 provided longer-range communications for armoured units and mobile headquarters. Wire lines laid by signal corps units connected fixed command posts. This redundant, overlapping system meant that even if one communication method failed, others remained available. American commanders at every level, from infantry squad leaders to corps commanders, could maintain awareness of their tactical situations and could issue orders that would be received and executed within minutes. The speed and reliability of American communications translated directly into combat effectiveness that German forces simply could not match. When an American infantry company encountered unexpected resistance, the company commander could immediately call for artillery support. Within minutes, sometimes within seconds, artillery fire would begin landing on German positions. Forward observers could watch the shell's impact and radio-precise corrections. The entire observe-adjust fire cycle that made American artillery so devastatingly effective depended absolutely on reliable radio communications. German forces facing American attacks often found themselves subjected to artillery barrages of such precision and intensity that they seemed almost supernatural. Shells would land exactly where they were needed, adjusted in real time based on observer reports, radioed back instantaneously. German soldiers, crouching in foxholes and cellars, while American shells systematically destroyed their positions, had no way of knowing that. They were experiencing the results of a communication revolution that had begun in American engineering laboratories years earlier. When American armored columns advanced, tank commanders could coordinate their movements with supporting infantry, with artillery units providing covering fire, with air support striking targets ahead of the advance, all through continuous radio communications. The combined arms coordination that characterized American offensive operations in the final months of the war would have been literally impossible without the reliable communications that FM radio technology provided. German defenders, trying desperately to organize coherent resistance, found themselves constantly outmaneuvered and overwhelmed by American forces that moved faster, coordinated better, and responded more quickly to changing tactical situations. The communication advantage was not merely technical. It was not simply a matter of American radios working better than German radios, though that was certainly true. The advantage was fundamentally operational and tactical. American forces could make decisions faster because commanders received accurate, timely information about their tactical situations. They could execute operations more effectively because orders reached subordinate units quickly and reliably. They could concentrate combat power at decisive points because they could coordinate the movements and actions of multiple units across distances that would have required German forces to use runners or messengers who might never arrive. In the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945, when more than 300,000 German soldiers found themselves encircled by rapidly advancing American forces, the collapse of German resistance was hastened significantly by their complete inability to coordinate any organized breakout attempts or even coherent local defense. German commanders had virtually no communications between units. They didn't know where other German forces were located. They couldn't coordinate movements or concentrate forces for counterattacks. They operated in complete tactical isolation, each unit fighting its own desperate, hopeless battle without any awareness of the larger situation. American forces, encircling and then systematically reducing the pocket, maintained perfect communications throughout. Battalion commanders knew exactly where all their companies were positioned. Regiment commanders coordinated multiple battalions in synchronized attacks. Division and corps commanders could shift forces rapidly to exploit opportunities or reinforce units encountering strong resistance. The entire American force operated as a coordinated whole, while the German defenders fought as isolated fragments. The Ruhr Pocket collapsed not primarily because of German shortage of ammunition or food, though those factors certainly contributed, but because the encircled German forces had lost the ability to function as a coherent military organization. Without communications, without coordination, without any way for commanders to understand their situations or to issue effective orders, the Wehrmacht units in the Ruhr simply disintegrated. More than 300,000 German soldiers surrendered in less than 3 weeks, one of the largest mass surrenders in military history. Similar patterns repeated across Germany in those final chaotic months of the war. Everywhere American forces advanced, they encountered German defenders who fought bravely and sometimes skillfully at the tactical level, but who could not coordinate effectively above the level of individual companies or battalions because they lacked the communications necessary for higher-level coordination. The German military, which had pioneered modern combined arms, warfare and mobile operations in the early years of the war, had been reduced by 1945 to fighting in a manner that would have been familiar to soldiers of the Franco-Prussian War 75 years earlier. The irony was profound and bitter. Germany, a nation that prided itself on technical sophistication and military excellence, had been defeated in part because it had failed to develop and field the kind of practical, reliable tactical communications equipment that American industry had produced in vast quantities. German engineers were certainly capable of designing sophisticated radio equipment. Germany had produced some technically advanced radio systems during the war, but Germany had never succeeded in fielding, in quantities sufficient to make a strategic difference, the kind of simple, rugged, reliable infantry radio that the SCR-300 represented. The reasons for this failure were complex and multifaceted. Germany's industrial capacity, never matching that of the United States even before the war, had been strained beyond its limits by simultaneous demands for tanks, aircraft, submarines, ammunition, and thousands of other types of military equipment. German industry had been forced to make choices about production priorities, and radio equipment had apparently never received the priority it deserved. The German military's doctrinal emphasis on offensive mobile warfare had perhaps led them to underestimate the importance of infantry communications, focusing instead on armoured and mechanized forces that could use vehicle-mounted radios. The German army's excellent pre-war training and unit cohesion had perhaps made them less aware of how critically important reliable communications became. Once units were no longer operating with experienced, well-trained soldiers and officers who understood each other perfectly and could often coordinate effectively with minimal communication. By the time Germany realized the extent of its disadvantage in tactical communications, probably not until 1943 or 44, it was far too late to rectify the situation. German industry was already under devastating assault from Allied strategic bombing. German logistics and maintenance systems were collapsing. German training programs could no longer produce radio operators in sufficient numbers. The window for developing and fielding improved communications equipment had closed, and Germany would fight the rest of the war with increasingly degraded communications capability. For the American soldiers who carried the SCR-300 and other radio equipment into combat, the technical and industrial history behind their radios was largely unknown and irrelevant. They didn't know about Daniel Noble's advocacy for FM technology, about the engineering challenges his team had overcome, about the institutional resistance that had been defeated, about the production achievements that had manufactured tens of thousands of sophisticated radios in remarkably short timeframes. What they knew was that when they pressed the transmit button and spoke into the handset, their voices reached their intended recipients, clearly and reliably. They knew that when they called for artillery support, the shells arrived quickly and accurately. They knew that when their company commander issued orders, those orders reached everyone who needed to hear them. They knew that they were connected to a larger organization that supported them, that could come to their aid, that maintained awareness of their situations. That knowledge, that confidence in their communications boosted morale and combat effectiveness in ways that were difficult to quantify but absolutely real. Soldiers who felt connected and supported fought more effectively than soldiers who felt isolated and abandoned. The psychological impact of reliable communications was as important as the tactical impact. The engineers who had created this communications revolution, the men like Daniel Noble and Henry Magnuski, and the others who had transformed theoretical radio technology into practical combat equipment, had never claimed to be heroes. Noble had been characteristically humble when receiving his Certificate of Merit from the United States Army, explicitly stating that the development of the walkie-talkie was merely an academic exercise compared to the contribution of the men on the battlefields. That humility was genuine and appropriate. No amount of technical innovation could substitute for the courage and sacrifice of the soldiers who actually closed with and destroyed the enemy, who endured artillery barrages and machine gun fire, who fought in conditions of terror and chaos that civilian engineers safely in laboratories could barely imagine. But those same soldiers understood clearly that good equipment that worked when you needed it, made their incredibly dangerous jobs somewhat less impossible. A radio that functioned reliably didn't prevent enemy bullets or shells, but it allowed soldiers to call for support that might suppress enemy fire, to coordinate movements that might avoid ambushes, to maintain situational awareness that might prevent fatal mistakes. The SCR-300 didn't win World War II by itself. Wars are won by soldiers fighting and dying, by industrial capacity producing weapons and equipment, by strategic decisions made by political and military leaders, by countless factors that combine in complex ways. But the SCR-300 and the communications capability it represented were among the tools that gave American soldiers advantages over their enemies, advantages that accumulated across thousands of tactical engagements to contribute meaningfully to strategic victory. In the decades after World War II ended, as military historians and analysts studied the conflict in detail, the importance of tactical communications became increasingly recognized. Studies of combat effectiveness compared forces with reliable communications to forces without, demonstrating quantitatively what soldiers had understood intuitively in combat. Forces with good communications suffered fewer casualties, accomplished missions more quickly, and achieved objectives with greater certainty than forces lacking reliable communications. The communication advantage that American forces enjoyed became a standard reference point in discussions of why American military forces were generally more effective than their enemies, despite often facing opponents with greater experience or superior tactical positions. The technology continued to evolve. The vacuum tube radios of World War II gave way to transistorized radios that were lighter and more reliable. Those in turn were replaced by radios using integrated circuits, then microprocessors, then sophisticated digital signal processing. Modern military radios can do things that would have seemed like science fiction to Daniel Noble and his engineering team. They can encrypt transmissions to prevent enemy interception. They can frequency hop across multiple channels to avoid jamming. They can interface with satellite communications systems to provide global coverage. They can transmit data as well as voice, feeding digital information directly into computer-based command and control systems. But underneath all that modern sophistication, the fundamental principles that Noble and his team proved in the SCR-300 remain valid. FM provides superior noise rejection compared to AM. Clear, reliable voice communications give commanders decisive advantages in understanding and controlling tactical situations. Simple, rugged equipment that soldiers can operate without extensive training is more valuable than sophisticated equipment that requires specialists to operate and maintain. The lesson of the SCR 300 extended beyond military communications to influence the broader development of radio technology. The success of FM in military applications helped demonstrate FM's superiority for many civilian applications as well. FM radio broadcasting, which had been opposed by established AM broadcasters before and during the war, gained acceptance after the war, partly because military experience had proven FM's capabilities. Mobile communications, whether police radios or early cellular telephone systems, or modern smartphones, all built on the foundation of FM technology that had been proven in combat during World War II. The story of the SCR 300 ultimately is a story about the power of innovation, about the importance of challenging conventional wisdom when you know there's a better way, about the willingness to take risks on new technology even when established systems seem adequate. Daniel Noble's insistence that FM was superior to AM for military portable radios, despite institutional preference for familiar AM technology, required both technical insight and personal courage. He was risking his professional reputation on a technical judgment that contradicted the preferences of military procurement officials. He was asking the military to trust his expertise over their own established practices. His willingness to take that risk, and his team's ability to deliver results that vindicated his judgment, changed military communications forever. For every American soldier who called in artillery fire that saved his unit from being overrun, for every company commander who coordinated his platoons through confused close-quarters fighting, for every battalion commander who maintained control of his unit during fluid mobile operations, the SCR 300 and the communications capability it represented made a real, tangible difference between success and failure, between life and death. Those soldiers probably never learned the name Daniel Noble. They almost certainly didn't understand the technical principles that made FM superior to AM. They didn't need to understand the engineering challenges that had been overcome or the institutional resistance that had been defeated. They only needed to know that when they pressed the transmit button on their radio and spoke into the handset, their voices would be heard clearly by the people who needed to hear them. That simple, reliable capability, revolutionary in 1944, purchased with years of engineering effort and manufacturing excellence, gave American forces an advantage that helped win World War II and changed warfare forever. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.